All right. So now that everything has, we've all made our turns, what we will do is and sort of getting people to provide also social support, because we found which the spread.
So good afternoon. Welcome everyone. I'm Melissa Gilliam. This is my colleague Patrick Jagoda. I understand that you come today because you believe in the humanities, and I think for many of us it's such an important part of our lives, but we don't always know why. And what we're doing is taking the humanities and applying it to a number of real-world situations. And so Patrick and I started this project. We've been doing actual work probably for about 2 years. But in the past year, we've started an interdisciplinary center that's allowed us to start the work of the Game Changer Design Lab. So we'll talk to you about our project and the lab in general, some of the issues and problems that we're trying to address through our work in the humanities and game design. And we'll then talk a little bit about kind of our hopes and aspirations for next steps and save time for questions. So I'll turn it to my colleague Patrick here.
Sure. We'll kind of turn back and forth. I'll just start with a little bit of an overview of the design lab itself and why we're doing games at all. So I'm curious, how many of you think of yourself as gamers in this room, in one sense or another? Okay, so fairly large number of people. So games were about a $56 billion industry in 2010. They're projected to be somewhere between $72 and $80 billion by 2015. Recent numbers from the last couple of years have indicated that there are about 183 million active gamers in the United States. And active gamers here means people who are playing games for about 13 hours a week. This includes mobile games, console games, board games, so a really wide variety of types. Also, one of the reasons that I'm interested in games is just because they're such a huge cultural phenomenon. Right, so Grand Theft Auto 5 came out a few weeks ago and sold $1 billion worth of games in 72 hours, breaking every previous entertainment record that existed in film and music in any other industry. Similarly, this is a form that's really occupying people's time. When another game came out, Call of Duty Black Ops, a couple of years ago, they had this announcement that after the first 2 months of gameplay, collectively, all the people playing this one game ended up playing around 600 million hours of the game, which is about 68,000 years. So if we're spending 68,000 years worth of time on the cultural form, we have to understand it psychologically, economically, culturally, and artistically. And part of the way that we take up games in humanities is through already existing fields. So in literature, for instance, right, we focus on the things that we usually focus on in studying the novel, for instance. So characters, narrative structures, things of that sort. Through visual studies, we study the graphics of these games, their styles. Through media studies, we start to get at questions of interface, for instance, questions of computation. On the anthropology side, there's a bit of participant observation work going on as well, looking at player activity and different kinds of player communities that form online and in real spaces around these games. Anyway, there are a variety of approaches, and there really is this rising field of game studies as well. And if you look at different universities, right, they take very different approaches to games. In places like USC or MIT, there's really an industry-based approach around designing and creating different kinds of games. In the digital humanities more broadly, right, in places like Harvard or Stanford, there's more of a focus on quantitative research, for instance. And part of what we want to do at the University of Chicago is bridge those approaches and focus both on the design side, which we'll talk about a little bit, and also on the research side, really broadly speaking. So bringing together analysis, design, and research. The last thing that I'll say is about the Game Lab itself, which started as a series of pilot projects that we'll talk about and recently became the Game Changer Chicago Design Lab. We work with youth primarily from the south side of Chicago between the ages of 12 and 20 for the most part. All of our projects are collaborative, whether we're making card games, board games, or video games, or digital stories. Many of our projects are kind of multi-form or kind of multi-linear narratives as well. We work with community organizations, we work with different artists, designers, and faculty to make these games, to study them. And the topics that we tend to focus on have to do with different forms of health, so sexual and reproductive health, as well as more broadly speaking, social and emotional health that youth, especially in high school, are going through. These are just some more of our parts of our mission. Try to reach urban youth through narrative and game design. We promote critical inquiry and analysis, systems-oriented thinking that I'll talk a little bit more about later. We focus on hands-on, project-based learning. We explore the digital humanities, broadly speaking, and focus on health issues. Our team is extremely interdisciplinary. I mean, coming from all over the map. We just hired 3 great game designers, Amanda, Ashland, and James. We have a digital storyteller with a youth activism background. We have people coming from health, from education. We also incorporate undergraduates and grad students at the university into our lab. So we have special fellowships that bring in, for instance, PhD students from English and comparative literature, an MFA in creative writing, and then undergraduates from philosophy, cinema, media studies, and so forth to really take part in the life of the lab and contribute to our projects both on the design and the research side. And I'll turn it over to Melissa.
So these are lab people, if you want to raise their hand.
Yeah, please.
Cortez, Ragnar, Bill. So how do you come to have a physician speaking on a day about humanities? So the idea behind the lab is starting to address major issues that are facing us as a society. The way that I came to this was in my own concern about disparities in reproductive health. And typically, if you come from the part of the campus I do, which is the medical center, when we talk about health, we look at numbers like this, public health statistics, which show that there are certain areas of the country that have concentrated areas of some of the worst public health problems, whether it's chlamydia, gonorrhea, adolescent pregnancy. And certainly as my field is gynecology and as a person who works with adolescent girls, these have been some of the major issues that I've spent my career addressing. However, as many of you have probably read, the rates of teen pregnancy have actually decreased quite a lot in this country. It's been one of the most significant things in 2000, in the past decade. But what was really interesting for me as I was talking and speaking to girls in my clinic was that even as they weren't getting pregnant, many would get to college and have a lot of problems with college, whether it was economic issues or having trouble with their grades. And what I was seeing is that really some of these health issues were the tip of the iceberg. One of the ways that I like to look at it is this idea of people live in very different Chicagos, right? So for some people, if you're a tourist, we look at this beautiful, shiny downtown loop, whereas other people are really dealing with a much more difficult aspect of Chicago. One of my earliest studies was trying to prevent repeat teen pregnancy in adolescent mothers. And we did a great job. We did a great job with the education, with the starting to initiate a method of contraception. And I was at Northwestern. It was a time when Cabrini Green still existed. And what I found was that most of the patients never came back for their 6-week follow-up visit because it was really hard. They were an adolescent mother. They lived in these tall buildings. Half the time the elevators were broken. And so it is the issues that we often see if we just stay in our own environment, we often miss the other larger health problems behind it. In about 2010, I started to say, what can we at the University of Chicago begin to do to address these problems? They're really beyond one discipline. They're beyond what I'm going to see just in my clinical office. This is an image of a conference that we held actually up at the Gleacher Center. And we have faculty from the Divinity School, from economics, from the School of Social Administration, the Urban Education Institute, people from almost every school in the institution starting to say, what can we do to address major problems affecting youth? And as a result, we started an interdisciplinary center called CI3. And the 3 I's are interdisciplinary, inquiry, and innovation in sexual and reproductive health. And so it's really kind of a deeper and more complex view of reproductive health, where we think about it over time and across systems. And that type of idea, thinking about working with young people across time, and not only just from I'm going to see you in my clinic and say you have this problem, but across the multiple systems that affect their lives. That's the spirit that embodies the work that we're doing in Game Changer. So we'll now turn to talk a little bit about Game Changer itself. Are you going there? Is this okay? So just to talk a little bit about the theories that inform our work. A lot of our work right now is being funded by both the MacArthur Foundation as well as the Collegium. And we have a number of theories that inform what we do, but one of the most important is this idea of connected learning. The idea behind connected learning is that most of us sit in kind of a triangle, or young people especially, of school, out of school time, and also family. If one of those legs of the stool, this kind of three-legged stool, if one of those legs is not fully enforced, then maybe what we can do is work in another area to help improve what happens in another setting. So for example, intensive work in the out-of-school space may influence what happens in school. But the other piece is what happens if it's interest-driven? What happens, the difference between what learning looks like if a young person's really compelled to do it because it's what they really want to do versus I'm forcing you to do it because I want you to play the piano versus I love the piano. And if we can take that type of interest-driven learning and use that to start to leverage what happens in the out-of-school space, to start to think about what happens in school, and then to think about what happens at home, working also with parents, schools, then we begin to connect these learning experiences. So that's one of the things that we've been experimenting with. So we have a real crossover into fields like education. The other piece is games, right? So we are ultimately academics and we're researchers, and so we're also really interested in studying games themselves. But we think games give a really great potential for learning. They're incredibly compelling. They address people at multiple levels. There's a huge emotional component. But we'll also show you that a lot of times I think there's a certain amount of perfectionism that's expected of people. Games are a little different, right? We fail, and we fail again, and we try again. It's not that all of these years that people have been spending on games that suddenly it's that the game itself is played one time through. It's that you fail, you have impasses, and you troubleshoot. And so that's what we're looking for, that idea, that willingness to fail, to try again, to get resilience. Those are the types of ideas that we're exploring. We use a lot of narrative and video in our work, and so one of the things that we'll do throughout this talk is show you just examples from the workshops that we've had, and also the voices of the youth that we work with. I think Cortez is the only one who's with us today, so he can also talk to you about it, but this is a pretty efficient one.
This is a segment from one of our workshops that led to a game called Lucidity, which was a transmedia game that moved between comic book style pages, videos, and short games, and all this had to do with the theme of sexual violence. So these are some scenes of the youth brainstorming, developing, and designing this game at the beginning.
What's the story, Eddie?
The story is, you want to tell them the whole story?
Yeah, just do as much as you do. You always do a great job with that.
Okay.
You always have had
So,
a really good sense of what it is.
The main character is Zarya. She told her dad she was spending the night at her friend's house. And she didn't even go to her friend's house. She went to the party. She went there, had fun. They was juking and stuff. Then a fight broke out. They started shooting, so her and this dude named Rico ran to the beach. And then it's a mystery game. We ain't gonna tell you too much, We ain't gonna give you the whole recipe, just give you a little taste. She goes to the doctor and she gets a test, but she didn't get it the first time, she got it the second. I don't really know about all the psychic part. Doctor told her that the test results would be back in a week. So she went home, she had terrible headaches, so she started laying down, and then the game started in her dream.
Who came up with all that?
Me. It was my main idea. I made the story up and everything, they just added parts to it. I gave some of them credit. The helping people.
You giving me credit?
Mm-mm.
Connected learning is really an old idea. It goes back to people like John Dewey. But what it says is that we learn all the time. We learn in school, we learn out of school, we learn from our peers. And what's so exciting for us in Game Changers to see these young people who come in and stay engaged throughout an entire day, intensively on project after project, but it's driven by things that they're interested in and driven by their stories.
No, I couldn't have put it all together, but I think the fact that everybody in the room had some experiences, everybody kind of contributed, so there should be a little piece of everybody's story in Zaria's character. What did you contribute? Because you were really vocal in the beginning.
This story, yeah, it's kind of a lot like my life, except the, rape part. But
right.
yeah, I do go with my dad's house over the weekend, except my dad lives in the suburbs and my mom lives in the city.
So it's the reverse.
So it's the other way around.
Okay. So did you contribute that?
I don't know.
I don't remember you contributed that. No. Okay, but it ended up in here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now I'm going to transition a little bit and just talk about some of our projects, focusing on one that we did last summer. So we've had a range of projects over the last few years. The first thing that we worked on was The Cache, which was an interactive web-based graphic novel, essentially, that used these comic book style pages, and players could move in different directions. So it was hypertextual, right? It used hyperlinks to allow players to explore different perspectives of different characters. The second project that we worked on was called Stork, which was an alternate reality game. So it included youth both playing games in physical spaces and also in online spaces. And it was a single mystery that kind of unfolded across phone calls and websites and videos and different kinds of files. Then we worked on Life Changer, which was a curriculum that used storytelling and games to get at sexual health. And we tested this out at Chicago Press, which is a charter school in the city of Chicago that focuses on game-based methods and hands-on learning in every subject. Our next project was Infection 4, which we're still working on. I'll say more about that later, but it's a 4-player role-playing card game, basically, that uses various game mechanics to get at sexually transmitted infections. And then finally, Lucidity, which you saw the workshop footage from, was a transmedia game that incorporated video, photos, comics, websites, and small mini-games, like room escape games, for instance, through which the story was told. I'll show you a piece of this is a 50-second trailer that we had for the Lucidity game that shows some of the actual assets from the game that youth helped us create. The designers within the lab did all of the post-production on the other end. So we always include youth in the process, but also bring in professional game designers. Lucidity at luciditygame.com if you want to play it. It combines many of our main themes about teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and sexual violence. One case study that we want to focus on in slightly greater detail here is an alternate reality game that we created. Who here has played an alternate reality game before?
Can you define that real quick?
I absolutely can. So I would describe an alternate reality game as first of all, a transmedia experience. So when you're playing a 3D game, let's say World of Warcraft or a first-person shooter, you're in a single world that you're moving through. Whereas in a transmedia game, you're oftentimes moving between your computer and your phone and real-world spaces. So it's kind of a scavenger hunt that plays out throughout various media and throughout different spaces. It also relies on networks and participatory cultures. So players are oftentimes adding to the story in different ways. are pushing the story forward, are finding pieces of the story that are fragmented and scattered across space and time. And these games are oftentimes lead to kind of total involvement. People get really obsessed about solving the mystery and really being part of the story in a very intense way, and just playing with other people. But if you think of it as a scavenger hunt with media components.
Like, do you have an example of a couple popular ones?
Yeah, so The Beast was a 2001 game that Microsoft produced, which ended up leading to the film AI, but it was a kind of promotional material for the film AI, and millions of people played that. There's a game called Isle of Bees that Fourth Wall Studios produced that was a promotional game for the video game Halo, but it was mostly a scavenger hunt. Year Zero was a game that 9 Inch Nails produced, another fairly popular one. But
There's a lot.
Yeah.
But it's a newest genre.
That's why I was like, how come I don't know what that is?
Yeah.
I was really very disappointed in myself for not knowing what that was.
yeah. It's still fairly fringe compared to Grand Theft Auto or whatnot. So the game that we ended up creating last summer for research purposes, that was one of these alternate reality games, was called The Source. Here you see some of our partners, including Chicago area partners, the mayor's office, the Art Institute, and so forth. This is kind of our development schedule for the game. It was the better part of a year, including the data that we're gathering now. But quite a bit of work went into it. So we had 140 youth playing this game for 5 weeks. And over those 5 weeks, they were coming in 3 days a week to campus for 6 hours each day. So it's quite intensive. Early on, we had to do things like secure bus passes for all of them to be able to come on a regular basis, pick up, make sure that all the meals were there, create webisodes, of which some of which I'll show you. So these alternate reality games too, right, have gameplay components to them, but the story is usually being told either through text or video or something like that. So we created 18 different webisodes that came to the players over the course of 5 weeks. So we're getting 3 a week.
Do you know what a webisode is? No. Yeah.
It's a television series essentially, but it's broken up into short segments. So each episode is, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes long, and you watch it online instead of watching it on your TV. But it's basically a TV series.
And we filmed it on a Mac in Ashland's apartment. And you'll see we have, we'll show you a segment of it, but we had 3 youth actors who acted out all of our episodes.
Yeah, and I'll actually turn and show you one of the episodes now so you get a sense. And I'll give you an overview of the story too, because the story was one of the more immersive components for some of the players, and it really drew some of them in. So the basic idea was that our main character was named Adia, and Adia was a 17-year-old high school student who was living on the south side of Chicago, and we find out early on that Adia hasn't known her father since the age of 5. She's now 17. And one day she stumbles across a letter from her father that describes an elaborate game that he created for her. And she starts playing this game with the hope that if she finishes it, if she wins, she'll find him on the other end after not seeing him for all of these years. But because she's busy with summer school and with all of these extracurriculars and doesn't have the time to complete the game, she crowdsources it to 140 players. And that's where the 140 high school kids actually came in and started playing through the game, helping Adia find her father and finish the game. What I'm about to show you is one of the prologues that we released just before the game started. And it's a description of Adia finding the letter, but it also sets the mood. So these webisodes too are very different from television in the sense that they're very, very do-it-yourself, right? It's somebody talking to a webcam, maybe bringing in some edited footage, pop culture references, things like that. But it's very simple by comparison to TV. So I'll play you a 4 or 5 minute segment here.
Hi, welcome to my room, my messy room. Adia. Not to be confused with Adia or Adia, just Adia. I didn't always like my name, not until I heard the story of it. My mom was 17 when she met my father, the age I am now. I don't know much about how they met, when, where, if my father had any game. TMI, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Okay, so I don't know much about how my mom met my father. If mom rejected him, so he made her a mixtape, an actual old school tape. If he had any manners, open doors, or if he was broke and they had to split his snow cone. Apparently, he couldn't dance and save his life. Mom says I get my dancing genes from him.
It's not unusual to be loved.
No. Jesus. I do know my brother eBay showed up shortly after, and 10 years later, April 9th, 1996, he's the one that named me. Gender, girl. Origin, African. Meaning, being a gift. Grandma called it unplanned, Mom called it a surprise. He called it a gift. His present. Mom says this really captures the optimism of my father. He left when I was 5. And my father, the magician, only visited us in stories, photographs, and missed calls we imagined. And several years later, surprise, a letter. And you won't believe what it says.
So that gives you a sense of the kind of thing that players were seeing 3 times a week. And some players weren't that interested in the story, were more interested in solving the puzzles. But there was one team that became entirely obsessed with actually finding Adia's father. And there's a long story that goes with that, but them actually finding that somebody who had a similar name to Adia's father and a similar job, and actually trying to find this human being out in the world. So one of the really compelling things about this game type is that it blurs the game world and the real world, and therefore makes learning more real. So I'll tell you a few more things about the source. The weekly schedule is basically such that on Mondays, players would play mini games online, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they would come to campus, or sometimes go to places like the Art Institute or the Museum of Science and Industry to undertake a scavenger hunt, where they would find further pieces of the story. Then on Fridays, some of the players came in for badge workshops where they would actually learn digital media skills. So how to make websites, for instance, how to do podcasting, how to do basic photography and video work, and so forth. Again, one of the reasons that we used games was because of the hands-on component, the fact that we didn't have to lecture at youth as we're doing now to you, but they could actually be engaged at every single moment. Also the games that we were creating, which included board games, card games, role-playing games, and kind of more video game style stuff, engaged youth using different learning styles. So things like text, graphics, audio, interactivity, social engagement. And so different members of different teams could shine at different moments through different exercises. We ended up creating about 30 to 40 mini games over the course of these 5 weeks. So there were many small modules along the way. To give you another quick example, one of the things that I think games get at that other forms of learning don't is systems thought. So taking a complex system or network and making sense of how its different components are connected. So one of our games, which isn't pictured here, this is an outdoor game, was a board game called Power Play. And Power Play was about different forms of energy, different resources, and youth essentially had to choose between coal power, wind power, nuclear power, build an infrastructure across the city of Chicago on a board, and then balance between profits and CO2 production. And so really had to think about the larger system of economics and the science of it as well. And the game, again, as Melissa was saying, didn't require anybody to be an expert, right? You could fail along the way and still learn really interesting things. But instead of focusing on facts, we had them focus on relationships between organizations and strategies that depended on the actions of other actors in this larger system. So I'm going to show you one more video of some of the youth playing this actual game, Power Play, as well as another game that had to do with sexually transmitted infections over the course of the source.
This is infection C, and basically what it is, you have to stop the infections of gonorrhea and chlamydia from spreading to your home base.
This is what the layout is. So the red is chlamydia and blue is gonorrhea. We either have to build treatment centers and prevention centers to protect it from keep spreading.
I think that stops these from spreading.
Yeah, because it's on the border. This ward looks like it maybe is a treatment center that's going to spread.
You're gonna take over the first though. Wait, I'm gonna take away something that's gonna spread close to that.
You have to watch out for like patterns on how like the diseases spread, and you have to use a lot of teamwork, and you have to think very, very critically.
Could one of you build a treatment center up here next round so we can start taking care of some of this disease? So if I put
the only ones that are playing is that one, and that one.
I think it's a good game to play because it teaches us about the spread, how quickly disease spread.
Because that's the way we understand stuff. Like we play video games all day, and that's like we get into them stories.
When you're getting information from reading, do you have to really use that information?
You reading it, you just like seeing it in your mind, but like if you're doing it on there, you actually doing it, and you actually understand it more.
It's like a bigger stimulation of like a real life situation. A game would be the best way to get as close as you can to actually trying to see how it works.
When we're designing games, we have to start off with a number of constraints and ideas and theories that inform what we're doing. So a lot of the theories and thinking behind this game came from two things. One is we designed it in connection with the Chicago Summer of Learning. This is an initiative of the mayor's office where he wanted every young person in Chicago to have an opportunity for a rich learning experience. But we were also working with the National Science Foundation, exploring this idea of 21st century literacies and competencies. What do young people need to basically function well in the 21st century? And so they're exploring a number of different ideas, and this came from the National Academy of Sciences, thinking that beginning to have young people work in collaborative teams, opportunities for leadership, opportunities to fail, opportunities to have critical thinking. So as we designed the game, we had these different ideas behind. From the mayor's office, the idea of STEM, in their hands it was called STEAM, so it becomes science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And then from the work of the National Science Foundation, really thinking about what other types of skills we can build with young people. So one of the very big components of this was a team-based approach. When young people came in, they were divided into teams of about 10 players for a total of 13 teams. Each team had an animal name, rhino, turtle, we refer to them as Team Turtle, and that really allowed them to have sort of this collective, collaborative approach to gameplay. But then there's also quite a lot of inter-team competition. And so they had a leaderboard at the end of each week. They would have different points, and we would tally points. And so there was a lot of competition for solving problems. And so you can see they really had to work very collaboratively. We had a great room behind a building behind SSA, and each team had their own team room where they could work. And some rooms were bigger, and a couple of teams could work there. And the other component we looked at was mentorship. It's a very important part of our lab is the idea that games allow collaboration. They allow new partnerships new fields, new disciplines to come together, but also intergenerational learning. So each of these teams was led by two students, other undergraduate, graduate students, many of them from the University of Chicago, but others from other institutions. At the end of each week, we also had an opportunity for hands-on learning here on campus. And so each youth could choose a different pathway of learning through the game. And so, for example, on Fridays we would have a web design program where they worked one-on-one or in small groups with a student who helped them with a curriculum based on web design. As Patrick mentioned, we're really interested in hands-on. The idea that when things are tactile, give you immediate feedback, you can see what you don't know, what you do know. So lots of hands-on learning. The other concept for why young people, especially first generation young people whose families have not gone to college, one of the reasons that they often sort of give up on fields related to science and technology is that they can't always see that it's socially relevant. They want to do something that they've been given such an opportunity, they want to do something that really makes a difference, and these fields don't seem to do that. So the other component is that we wanted each week to represent some type of issue that had related to a social issue. And so they're essentially using science or technology to address an issue that they see in their community every day. So the 5 issues that we addressed were sustainability, health equality, bullying, immigration, and sexual rights. And so each week we were able to take some concept, whether it was relating science to sexually transmitted infections, technology to another field. With each area they were able to see that it was related to a social justice issue. The other thing we did was bring in a variety of health professionals and other professionals from various fields. So they didn't only see math, solve math problems, they then worked with mathematicians. With health, they worked with epidemiologists, they worked with doctors, they worked with public health professionals. So they could really see not only are these skills that you can acquire, but they actually can be used, and then they met people who are using them. The other thing that we were exploring is a concept called digital badging. And one of the things that's really nice about this work is that Chicago is serving as a test case for a lot of new concepts in education that through predominantly the mayor's office, but also the work of the MacArthur Foundation, is really serving as an example for cities across the country. And so one concept is this idea of digital badging. This is predominantly being developed right now by Mozilla, and we work directly with the Mozilla Foundation on a lot of this work. And the idea is that for every skill that young people develop, they would have basically a badge, a digital badge, that would become a portfolio of the activities and skills that they know. Think about it like a CV, but that's universally recognized. And so that was as they went through, they not only earned points, but they also earned badges that connected them to larger opportunities in the city. This is something that's aspirational and still working on developing it, but we're happy to talk to you more about the concept of badging. And then the other question is research. Our goal is to understand and study the work that we're doing. The funding that we got from the Natural Science Foundation actually acknowledged that we don't really know how to study games. We don't even know how to study learning in this way. And so we actually took a lot of approaches to research. We did a pre-test, post-test, and we'll follow young people throughout the year. We'll also work with Chapin Hall here to get access to grades and to see what grades look like compared to young people who did something completely different during their summer. We did a lot of surveys, but we also did a lot of qualitative research. And we've also had the Center for Elementary Math and Science Education come in and do a very independent, so we were doing some of this research ourselves, evaluating the project. What's been really nice is that we've had everyone from English to medicine to social science to economics involved in our interdisciplinary research team. And so those ideas are still being developed. So we're going to start winding down by telling you a little bit about what comes next for us. And So the first is we mentioned the card game that we developed called Infection 4. Infection 4 was developed last summer in a workshop with a lot of play testing. It's continuing to get reiterated and modified. And here's sort of an example of it. And these are the art assets that we developed for it. And just to give you sort of a sense of how these games are a little bit different in our hands. So there's a small medical component, almost, Patrick was telling you today, like a flashcard where you sort of see a disease, you understand a little bit, almost like a rock, paper, scissors mechanism where, antibiotics treat this disease. But what we're interested in is not infections as it's medical. We're interested in the social and emotional, the way that we think about them and how illness is more of a personal and internalized and social phenomenon. And so Infection 4 actually has components where young people have to give advice about how to deal with it, or there's a component where they actually go to the place where they're kind of ruminating and thinking and dealing with issues of shame and guilt, and then working collaboratively to talk about how you would deal with those issues. And so our next step is that Infection 4, it's gone through a lot of iterating, it's gone through a lot of play testing. Now we hand it over to the research team and it'll go into the field. And we'll do some initial qualitative research, understanding so we can better understand how young people use it, how they think about it. Then we'll supplement that with curriculum, and then the next step is to start to disseminate it more widely and into school districts and into classrooms.
And as part of this project, we also had a few grad students from cinema and media studies in particular come join us, including Ian Jones, who's up here. People who are, writing dissertations about game studies, but also have a background in design and could serve as mentors as we develop the first version of the game. Another game that we have going right now is called the Hexago Board Game Suite, and this started with the source, right? As I showed you, we were using board games from week to week, which made us think, what if we had standalone board games that weren't part of a larger transmedia game or a larger alternate reality game, but something that we could take into classrooms, we could take into different organizations, and something that didn't require computers, for instance, or smartphones, like a very simple board that could be easily circulated. So we wanted to do something that was not digital, it was primarily analog, and we're building a whole series of games about economics and ecology and so forth on this single board, and Ashlyn Sparrow is our lead designer for this. Another project that we're working on is called A Day in the Life, and this is a computer game where we're trying to think about decision-making in a high school setting. So taking a lot of these themes that we've already worked through, like bullying, for instance, and think about what kind of sense of self a high school student develops around making one decision versus another. So the basic template for the game will be that you play for, let's say, about 30 minutes. You go around and have conversations with different characters. You make different decisions based on branching tree structures. And then after 30 minutes, you get to replay the game and make a different series of decisions and have conversations that you weren't able to have the first time and see what kinds of consequences take place there. Another one of our major goals moving forward is to develop a mobile games unit. So currently there are around 6 billion cell phones in the world, right? So if you want to move from a kind of Chicago-based approach to something more global, which we're thinking about, mobile phones rather than video game consoles are probably the way to go. Smartphone use, for instance, is estimated to grow by 81% each year until 2017, already starting at 6 billion users. Youth especially, right, are using smartphones for a variety of things, from texting to gaming, obviously, and it's just a major area that we hope to develop in. The next thing too is we finally have a lab space where our designers and our youth fellows and our players can come. But we're hoping to produce a kind of a larger, more robust space that can really serve as a long-term lab, both for CI3 and for Game Changer. The very last thing that I want to say is, I'm a professor of English, so some of you may still have a question of, why is this stuff about games and technology and STEAM and science relevant in the humanities? And one reason, contextually, right, is that the visual humanities have been a really huge umbrella field over the last 10 to 15 years. And many digital humanities projects have to do with large-scale data sets, for instance, right? I mean, thinking about the way that literary genres change over the 19th century, for instance, and using computation to answer those kinds of big questions. But more and more new media and new forms of storytelling are also entering into the field of the digital humanities. And I see the Game Changer Lab as having these 4 interventions into the digital humanities. The first thing that right now, many critiques of the fledgling digital humanities attack them for having limited engagement with identity issues and social justice issues. So in many cases, digital humanities practitioners want to bracket questions of race and class and gender and sexuality in favor of getting the data. And we refuse to do that, right? We're interested in both sides. We want to get the data, we want to do the research, but we also want to work with youth from the south side of Chicago. We want to grapple with a number of social justice themes. Second of all, we're thinking about the importance of transmedia design as a research method. We don't think of design as mere decoration, right? We think of it as a different way of thinking with your hands, thinking with other people, which brings us to the third point, which is the importance of collaboration as a key organizational technique in the humanities. So when we think of the humanities historically, right, we think about a single individual writing a dissertation or a book or an article and eventually circulating that on the other end. And more, we want the process of coming to knowledge and circulating knowledge to happen across the disciplines. I mean, it's a joyful thing to come into the lab and see, again, PhD students in comp lit and English and computer science talking to one another and producing these projects and the research around them. And fourth of all, we're also looking at the changing relationship between the humanities and the sciences. We oftentimes talk about interdisciplinary research, right? I mean, that's been part of the jargon for decades. But in fact, so little research has people from different divisions, like the medical and the science side, coming together with people from the humanities. And there is a kind of fear or paranoia in the humanities sometimes about science and engineering stealing all the funding. I don't think that needs to be the case, right? I mean, if there are, certainly Game Changer is not the only way to do this, but games are one place where all of these interests and disciplines can come together into a project that allows us to answer questions that any one discipline simply couldn't answer. So in closing, we just want to thank our design lab staff, our fellows, our mentors and visitors from the source this summer, and also many of our funders, such as the MacArthur Foundation. And thank you all for coming and giving us an hour of your time.